sponsors.
Hello, welcome everybody, and welcome to Voices on Radio Zindagi 1170 AM. And today, with an esteemed panel of experts, we are going to discuss hate crimes against Asian Americans, the history, and what we can do to prevent it. If you have anything to talk to us about this issue, please call the studio number at 510-657-1170. And this is being broadcast live on Facebook. Our handle is Radio Zindagi. Please go watch it there as well. Racism against Asians in the US became long before even the pandemic and, of course, the recent shootings. And again, this bears witness to an uptick in anti-Asian sentiments. This becomes even more important for us to be educated because our community is on the forefront of these reckless stereotypes and racism. We will talk about this and more with an extremely esteemed panel. Today we have with us Sheikh Paul, whose day job is, of course, to be the Chief Investigative Counsel at the U.S. House of Reps, but he is on this panel in the capacity of the Chairman of the Virginia Advisory Board to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, in which capacity he oversaw a multi-year examination of hate crimes and includes, of course, the experiences of attending the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. He is in his second term as a chairman, and that role seems to have more relevance to this topic right now. We have with us Sheridan Tatsuno, who, apart from being a celebrated technologist, is also a contributing writer to Nikkei Heritage, and is an advisor to the National Japanese American Historical Society. We have also with us Sarah Ting, who's the founder and president of World Unity Incorporated. She's a humanitarian and a diversity advocate. She's a Chinese American woman, a visionary. She's an inclusion and diversity educator, speaker, and author. And she founded World Unity Incorporated in 1993. She advances equality, diversity, and inclusion in America, and is empowering individuals through arts education and innovative ideas. We also have with us Justin Shaw, who ran for Fremont mayor recently and also teaches business law as an adjunct professor at Ohlone College. He is active in his local community, serving as a board member at the Ohlone College Foundation and as chair of the Asian American Millennials for American Advancement. So here's the esteemed panel, and let's get started. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So before we get started on what's happening around us, shall we just take a look at what you think is the basis of this hate in the first place? What is the root cause of this hate? Where did it get started? Shall we start with you, Justin? You're local here in the Bay Area. What is the root cause of this hate?
I think that in America, we have this notion, this culture, and that's been here for hundreds of years. And sometimes other people, other cultures are scary to people who didn't grow up with those cultures. And I think that in itself, and immigration waves and just the history of, immigrants from Asia, from China, the Philippines, Japan, India, and they're all different, right? It's not always the easiest interface between, what was before and what is now. And I think we can't start talking about this without start talking about the history as well as anti-Blackness, quite frankly, in America. Yeah.
Sheridan, you come from a very different experience. Of course, the Japanese experience in America has been different as well. I mean, of course, it's been similar to a lot of us, but it's also different because of the history. How is the Japanese American experience a little different?
Well, my family was put and turned into World War II concentration camps in Topaz, Utah. My father actually secretly took home color home movies of Topaz, Utah. It's now in the Library of Congress, National Film Archive, second home movie after the Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination. So I heard a lot about the World War II camps when I was a child. In fact, too much. Whereas most of my colleagues never heard of it because the Japanese Americans were silent because of the shame, because everybody was considered second-class citizens. Now, the camp, though, was really the summary of a lot of things. I mean, if you go back, actually, there's 8 reasons for this hate 8 different reasons. And you look at geopolitics, Asian colonialism happened, and then we had World War II when Japan became colonialist. And then we had Japan bashing during the 80s. We had the rise of Asia, and now China. So that's just one. Then we had this labor versus capital, where the wealthy farmers and factories imported cheap Asian labor to undercut the white labor, which caused, and that same thing happened in the East Coast. So you had that antagonism against cheap Asian labor and Irish labor and Italian labor. And then you have nativism, and that led to the Exclusion Acts and alien land laws, going through history, going back since the Chinese. And then you had the 1965 immigration law, which led to a huge boom of Asian American immigrants, but we weren't prepared for it because we didn't think about the implications of it. So we were caught off guard. And then, of course, you have China's rise now, and it's going to grow even more. So it's going to get worse. And then you have the military, because the military has gone back, unfortunately, because of that, Asian American women are stigmatized and treated like prostitutes and call girls because of the Asian and American soldiers in Asia for such a long time. And they bring those attitudes back. And of course, Obama says we're going to have an Asian shift now. So there's more military going on. It's going to get worse for Asian American women and Asian women. Then, of course, you have the media, the stereotypes, the last 150 years. I mean, every possible stereotype you could think of. The Asians are usually the butt of everybody's jokes and has no representation. I'm a screenwriter. I'm trying to change that one. And then, of course, you have the model minority. And that's the most, I think, pernicious because Asian American, you just look at the elite, Silicon Valley, all the top people, they assume Asian Americans are all wealthy. Wrong. Probably half or more in poverty. And so there's this strong dislike toward the rich, like the crazy rich Asian, a huge amount of resentment, jealousy, and envy against Asian Americans because everybody stereotypes as super rich when it's not true. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for this hatred out there. And, it's just COVID just triggered it all.
Absolutely. What about you, Sarah, as a Chinese American woman? That entire journey, that experience in America, how has the journey been?
Well, first of all, I thank you for inviting me to be part of this very distinguished panel. And Sheridan did a great job outlining the 8 reasons, and I really appreciate the comments that Justin made. So I grew up in this country at a time when there were very, very few Asians. And I think when you are a person of color, and in my case, Chinese, you do have to ask the question, what does it mean to be, in my case, a Chinese American in America? I obviously would not have to ask that question if I was living in China. So you have to confront yourself with this question. What does it mean to be Chinese living in America? And one important point I want to make here, all of this was created by human beings. Prejudice and biases are created by human beings. And Sheridan identified a very important human quality, jealousy. So though you can never eliminate jealousy from humanity, fear is also a driving factor. So whether it's jealousy because you're making more money, jealousy because you're smart, or whatever, but that is a force that we will never eliminate. And people have to come to terms with what's the real issue that is driving this hatred. Fear is the underlying issue or feeling in all of them. So as I was growing up, having to come to terms with what it means to be Chinese so that I would not become a victim of biases and prejudices, so that I would see myself as a human being filled with potential and not let anything stop me from realizing whatever goals that I had. So I think that for me, I can remember as a child asking questions like this when I was in elementary school, 10 years old. Wow, how different would my life be if my eyes were round? I never verbalized that. It was just a voice inside my head, always there. until you reach a point where you come to know who you are. You are a human being just like anybody else, and our differences are the beauty of who we are, not supposed to be a liability because you're a different color, a different sexual orientation, different economic status. We are all human beings first. That's where we need to be rooted, and that is not what's happening right now.
Sheikh, what was your experience? You not only experience as a as an Asian, Asian American, of course, but also as somebody who has been on the forefront of dealing with hate crimes for such a long time.
Well, first, thank you for including me on this panel. I think my experiences echo a lot of what everyone else had to say. Sheridan talked very eloquently about the intersectionality of these issues. There is no one thing that we can point to as the root cause of all of this. All the factors that Sheridan mentioned are not only vital, but each of them in their own way drive successive iterations of this. This is not the first time that we're seeing this. Justin talked about, a great word, the othering, which has been the story of the Asian American experience going back 140, 150 years. Right? That's what led to exclusion, to internment, to post 9/11 security structure and how racial profiling became an institutional aspect. And you're seeing it again today. It's my experiences are slightly different. It sounds like everyone else on the panel is from the Bay Area, which has just, culturally a much longer and larger Asian presence. I was born in Indiana and spent most of my adult life on the East Coast, from sort of the Boston, New York, DC corridor. I was in New York on 9/11, and with my name and looking the way I do, that was a difficult time in the days afterwards. And that was actually how I first got into civil rights work. But again, this notion of othering, no matter what we achieve, no matter what we contribute, no matter what we do, we are always by certain segments seen as other. And there is an effort, whether it be driven by any of the factors that Sarah mentioned, whether it be by jealousy or fear, or let's call it what it is, in some sectors, just pure hate, there is this desire to maintain the existing power structure by othering people that are seen as threats, whether it be based on economic achievement, academic achievement, or social integration. What you're seeing today is just the latest iteration of that. After 9/11, you saw a rise in hate crimes against South Asians, against Muslims, and now in the wake of COVID, I will come on and say I think the rhetoric of the former president contributed directly and fundamentally to that. Not necessarily in a causal sense, but it provided a license, right? It made it okay for people that harbored certain feelings that were, one step away from acting on them, hearing the commander-in-chief use that language, use words like, the Wuhan flu, the Kung flu, and provide the license, I think opened the door to what you're seeing, particularly in your area, sort of the day-to-day, senior citizens getting shoved down on the street in Queens, a man getting slashed on the train. And then obviously, the horror in Atlanta. But I think, coming back to the two key points, I think it's othering and it's the intersectionality of all these different factors.
But coming back to that entire, the 6 or 7 years of blatant hatred that was relayed through every broadcast channel possible and propagated thereof. This existed before that. I mean, of course, there was this period of time where the model minority myth was propagated, and there was this really interesting article I read in it was the Wall Street Journal or Washington Post, where somebody actually wrote that why are Indians the model community? It's because they don't say anything. Right? Because they go with the flow. They don't really protest about anything. They just work, right? So, and it's the same. What was propagated of Asian Americans is also the same. We're a great community. We do our job. We pay our taxes. We go to school. We get good grades. And as long as we do that, we are perfect. But the fact of the matter is that this entire hatred has been propagated since times immemorial, since the first Asian American person sat on a ship, and it hasn't gone away. It has only been, it's only propagated since then. What is it that keeps helping this propagate? It has not been, it has not been whatever we have done as communities, as Asian Americans in this country, whatever achievements we have made, we are still not mainstream.
So
What is it that, Sarah, how about you? Why don't you take?
Well, I just want to say, we all know that there are obviously people who do value us. So we don't want to make a blanket statement and say everybody in America hates Asians. I want to really make that clear. I think that the part of the problem that is contributing to this, social media and the internet did not exist 30 years ago. That is a global platform operating 24/7. None of us here, no one has control over what is put out there. And we all know there are many stereotypes, images that perpetuate stereotypes. And there's more than probably 100 people per city who have an intolerance for differences. And that's probably on the low side. So if you do the math, that is what's contributing to promoting these intolerances and the acceleration of people's negative feelings towards Asian Americans. So I think it's incumbent upon us, for those who want to advance equality, is to plant messages that counteract these negatives, but not get into a war of words, but to put out information that is enlightening, empowering, and inspirational, not that evoke an antagonistic response and back and forth, but to put out information, as I said, that enlightens, empowers, and inspires.
If I
Well
could just,
said, well said, Sarah. Sheik, you had something to say. Sorry.
yeah, I just want to add on to that. In terms, I think it's very important to understand the big picture. We are rightly very concerned and shocked by the spike in violence and hate crimes against Asian Americans. Statistically, this spike pales in comparison to anti-Semitic hate crimes, which year in and year out, by far the largest number of incidents. You know, I mean, the incidents of this week with George Floyd and the subsequent two shootings in Minnesota show that this is a massive issue in the African American community. So I don't want to, you know, as Sarah said, like we do have a lot of support, and we should rightly use our platform to call attention to what is happening. But let's also remember that it is not just us. There's a lot of hate against a lot of groups, and it has been there for a long, long time.
So, sorry. Thanks so much for that perspective, Sheikh. But Sheridan, was it Sheridan? Sheridan, did you have something to say here?
Yeah, okay. I studied urban studies, political science, and we looked at hate crimes and demographics. One of the big challenges is based in census. If you look at it, the non-white population is growing faster than the white population. So we call it the Alamo defense. Many of the white population, because they've been unemployed, because of the destructuring, have lost their jobs, and there's the role in society, and it was caused by Wall Street in the Midwest and other places, in agriculture, bagger farms, kicking people off the farms. So you have a lot of poor white people who Trump appealed to, and correctly so, but it wasn't our fault. It was Wall Street that caused it. All right. So you have this, and then you have the increase of non-white people, which is a threat. So I call it the Alamo. Many of the people who are in the white community, and I have a lot of friends in all these red states because we talk to them all the time. They're dog people. We're really good friends and lovely people, just like all my friends here. So frankly, I don't see any difference between most red state people and white people and myself. The challenge is the loss of jobs, prestige, and the fear of the unknown, which is the increase of Asians and Black and everybody else, is a problem. And I think it comes down to education. I agree with Sarah. I think education, enlightened education, is probably the only way to do it. And you've got to get to the kids young, before they're, when they're like 3 or 4 years old. because it starts. For example, my daughter was in Silicon Valley, in Fremont. Okay, she was practically the only Asian in there, and it was a black girl, and they both got outcast by all the white kids before it was Indian, and so they kind of clunched together because everybody kind of turned back to them. So it starts as early as preschool, and so we need to address it early because racism is taught by family, friends, and society. It is taught. It is not inherited. And I think until Americans understand that, we will continue to teach people how to hate. And I think that's dangerous for this country.
Sheridan, thank you for that perspective. Justin, what do you have to say about that? What Sheridan said is really important. Racism is taught by society and community.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that what I want to push back on just a little bit is the fact that a lot of hate crimes against Asians, one, you don't know if it's often a hate crime because no one's going to say why they like beat someone up, right? Two, I think that universally in a lot of, these types of Asian hate crimes, people don't speak up, they don't report them. So yes, I do agree that, we should not be comparing to other groups, but I do not think we should minimize, especially ourselves as Asian Americans, the experience that, Asian Americans have to go through. And I think hate crimes and, everything else, stereotypes, biases, they're all related to that. And I think that I agree with, what Sheridan was saying. And I also think it's important not even just to talk about how Americans, how everyone we should change and, not pass on, a lot of our biases and prejudices. And it's, easier said than done, of course, but also looking internally in ourselves, like, why is it that when I was growing up as a millennial, very few Asian Americans who I saw, even my own generation or before, maybe 10 years back, why were people not speaking up about, the discrimination they faced? Why, I think that perhaps something that Asian American communities tend to do, or individuals, both community-wise and at the individual level, is to minimize, in a sense, our own pain and suffering and just, discount it. It's not as big of a deal. I'm just going to keep my head down, do my work. I'm going to do a good job and I'm going to earn the respect of others. But at the end of the day, if you can't advocate for yourself, or we can't advocate for ourselves, who's going to advocate for us? And I think that it's just as important to advocate for yourself as it is to advocate for other communities as well, because it is truly a solidarity type. We have to work together, but not forgetting ourselves as well. Yeah.
That's very well said, actually, Justin. So let's look at the pandemic and what the last 1 year, like for 2 months now, has done to us as Asian Americans. We have seen a general uptick in crimes. The hate against Asian Americans is at a all-time high, and let's talk a little bit about why that has happened, and not only here in America but worldwide. Asian Americans, especially Asians from China, have been at the receiving end of the world's hatred, and this is dangerous. Let's talk a little bit more about it. Sheikh, why don't we get started?
Sure. I think it's tragic, but it goes back to what we were saying earlier about sort of the confluence of geopolitics. And Sheridan mentioned the role of the media. It's very easy to the bad guy and point the finger at where all the blame should lie. Again, this too is cyclical. If you go back to the 70s in pop culture, all the bad guys were Russians and communists. Then, in the 80s, they were Arabs and the Middle East. And now I think we're slowly moving into where China is going to be the boogeyman for a lot of things. But again, as everybody on the panel has said, I think the response is rooted in fear. When you have fear of a situation that you can't control, I think it is a human tendency to lash out, and the media and political figures that have a platform to point those fingers give an easy target for people to lash out. I think it's multiple factors, but it makes it very easy to find a scapegoat.
So thanks so much, Sheikh, for that perspective. Sarah, is it justified to blame China for the pandemic? You're on mute. You're still on mute, Sarah. We can't hear you.
Sorry. Is that better?
Yeah, you're back.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I don't think it's justifiable to blame China. And as I said to one friend yesterday, a virus does not have an ethnicity. When you see all these graphic images of the coronavirus, I never saw any slanted eyes on these beautiful images of the coronavirus. So viruses do not have an ethnicity. Point one. Point two, when we're talking about why is this the highest level of hatred towards or anger and violence towards Asian and Asian Americans, again, social media. It has accelerated any kind of biases tenfold, 100-fold, because it's a global platform. And we have no control over what people choose to read and how they process what they just read. And too many people, unfortunately, just swallow what they see and they don't do critical thinking. Common sense tells you a virus is a virus. It does not have an ethnicity. The country that it comes from does not give it an ethnicity. It just means it came from there. Who knows? Maybe this virus was buried somewhere in an African continent and somehow migrated toward China. So Sheikh said this, the word scapegoating. This is also a phenomenon that's not new in America. This is not new. It is a human quality, the desire to blame someone else for a situation versus taking charge of it, working together to solve it, and not targeting a group of people because that's the easy way out. And people, when they're angry, they just want to lash out. And Sheridan pointed to the economic factor. When you have fear of how to put food on the table, then people act out. They're not thinking rationally. And who has become the target? The Asians. Why? Because it was referred to as the Chinese virus. But of course, you folks are responsible for it because it's the Chinese virus.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for that perspective that really lends to us really putting things into boxes that were unsaid, and we need to really talk to these things. Sheridan, you're a technologist. My question to you: there's a lot of rumor, and of course, these rumors have led a lot and lent a lot to hatred against Asian Americans, specifically saying that this was incubated, this was lab made. And of course, a lot of people who know how lab made viruses have really not been success. They know that this wasn't, but would you want to put your voice to it?
Yeah.
Was this
Um,
lab made?
well, okay, if you look at it historically, biological weapons, and chemical weapons have been produced going back thousands of years. I mean, and this is not new. And I hate to say it, but most governments, top governments, probably do secret biological and chemical weapon testing, all right, in labs. Wuhan is not the only place. This is one of the many. That said, I think the challenge we have today, we have the nuclear arms agreements, we have chemical agreements. We need to, because of the nature of travel now, international travel spreads diseases much faster than it did 30, 40 years ago. Um, so now we have to develop biological agreements on just like nuclear testing.
Hmm.
And it's a bigger problem than just Wuhan. I mean, people I think are trying to pick the latest, but if you look at the history of pandemics, just go to Wikipedia. There's like, and COVID's number 9 in the devastation, all right? And if you look at it, it's an international problem. There's been pandemics everywhere, from every Europe, Middle East, Asia, Africa, everywhere. So you can't really blame just the Chinese. I think um, the one of the things I actually read a book. I read a book a couple of years ago by the CDC manager, and he described the history of pandemics, and he had warned, like Bill Gates, there's a big one coming. But then, of course, and Obama planned for it, but then Trump's administration canned it and almost eliminated it. So we got caught with our pants down because of we actually reduced all our protections and we didn't staff up like Obama was going to do. Right. So it's not. Uh, okay, I'll be frank. It's not obviously China isn't our fault. We knew it was coming. Obama knew it was coming. Trump let it go and cut it back. Okay, so and if you look at it, one of the things and I was expecting a pandemic, but I saw the SARS pandemic, and then China was successful in cutting it back. So I said, oh, good, China's figured out how to stop these things early. Wrong. So, because, it's asymptomatic, which is harder, much harder than the former. So that's what makes this one really difficult. It's not like the other pandemics are like, you see it on your face immediately. It can be, quiet for 2 weeks or more. And that's what makes this one much more difficult. And that's why we need international agreements, not just blame China, because it's going to be here for forever practically. Different virulent.
Well, on that part, I agree with you definitely, Sheridan. I don't think there is going to be an end to this. We're not going to go back to 2019. That's for sure. I completely agree with you over there. Justin, you are in a district. You are in Fremont. You're hub of Bay Area. You're in between. You're in the corridor, especially the 101 corridor, where, of course, before the pandemic happened, a lot of traffic from China happened. And you and I both know that even before the world knew that the virus in Wuhan had broken, we knew that it happened because travel in most of our hardware companies had stopped. And there was an advisory in those companies that, people work from home. Even before the rest of America knew what was happening, we in Silicon Valley knew what was happening, and our offices went into lockdown. We were told what was happening. We knew things in ground. Even with that, we were prepared, and we know how to work from home. We've been doing that for years, and we were way ahead of time on a lot of things. But then things went. Things are fine, and then they went bad, and then this entire. We weren't expecting hatred here. We are used to a multicultural environment. What went wrong with Bay Area?
I still almost feel like sometimes these things, like, they happen, but they just aren't publicized or amplified. And may I ask a follow-up? When you say what went wrong, in what way do you mean what went wrong?
My question to you is, we're a multicultural environment. We work with the world. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. If we were a country, we would be big. We are used to working through the world. Why do we still have hate crimes here?
Oh man, I mean, why are humans still humans, right?
Quintessentially, yes.
I think what I will say is that, when lockdown happened, even earlier in January or February before March, I know that.
Actually, CES is when we knew this was happening, right?
Yeah, and I'm not going to say who, but, when JPM in San Francisco every January,
Jan 5th.
Biotech, I think there were some spreading of some COVID cases really early on there, and no one knew what.
Absolutely.
But I think that, I don't know. I think that, I think it's a very broad question. But, people are people, and I think that the best way is to just.
So that lends to human behavior, I guess, because we work with these people, we know them, we know this wasn't manufactured, we know that it wasn't China's fault, but we still have hate crimes in our.
People are afraid, first of all, for their own safety. So it's like people don't want to go to Chinese restaurants in January or February. Even Chinese people, I know a lot of Chinese people. Oh, I'm not going to go to a Chinese restaurant, and then it kind of trickles because. At the end of the day, you want to protect your own family, your own health, and then it starts to think, I see a Chinese person, they have the coronavirus, or then later on, everyone has it, and everyone's, blaming who can we blame? And it's this it's a cyclical effect, and it's not entirely healthy. But at the end of the day, it's kind of what Sarah was saying. It's what we're here with it, we're living with it. How do we move forward? Not so much who can we blame. And one other side note I do want to mention is I wish that it was easier to separate country, like the state, from the people, because even in China, if I go to China, I'm Chinese American, people be like, oh yeah, he's Chinese, right? Like Chinese first, American second. But I wish, I am so critical of the Chinese government because, they've done a lot of bad things. And it's like, it's unfortunate that we can't be more critical of China, the government, without, the trickle effect of, the anti-Chinese, anti-Asian sentiments that arise.
No, but Justin, I completely agree with you because the way we behaved ourselves as educated people who have worked with China, who work with China, our back offices are China, our supply chain is China. China controls the supply chain to the world. Right. The way we behaved, poof, all the venture funds disappeared overnight. Whoever we were working with shut down overnight. Chinese companies disappeared in the market. It was sad to see that happen in an environment that is so progressive, in an environment that depended on this economy for the longest time. And this is a part of how hatred can destroy the world. And it's another. These are lessons that we have to learn going further. These are things that we have to remember as communities too. But having said that, of course, going further, there is this political aspect to this entire story. This entire China problem, this entire hatred against Chinese Americans that has been sowed in people's heads, has now lent into hatred against Asian Americans in a bigger sense. Of course, all these shootings that have happened not across the country, but then this is translated into anti-minority hatred across the world. You see this nationalist movements, so many countries. This is becoming bigger all over the world. This anti-minority thing is becoming not only bigger, but it's filthy. It's full of hatred. It's not good for the world, and it's for some reason I feel it started with us. For some reason, the success story started with us. It worked for people here, and now we're translating it into legislation. And this is a discussion that I want to have. Is this anti-China legislation so important? And I want to talk to you about it, Sheikh, because you are in the center of it, you're in the throes of it, and you know more about it than all of us here in the panel would. Why is this legislation? Is it just for political reasons, or is there a reason why we need this legislation?
I'm not sure which legislation you're referring to.
So there is this. There are, of course, all the embargoes they're going to put against China. The tariffs are already there, which makes it. Of course, the tariffs don't work for China. They kind of harm us instead. That's one part of it. But then there are all these other sanctions they're going to put against China. So that's the other part of it, that they're going to introduce it in the House.
Yeah, I don't know that I would go so far as to conflate what we've been talking about on an interpersonal level with the other factors that play into sort of the international level, whether it be trade, whether it be politics, whether it be military relations. I do think, as others have mentioned, one of the things that when you have this tendency to lash out at a country, the response to that also is for whoever you're lashing out at to recede. And I think at this day and age, what this event has shown us is that we need greater global engagement to try to quickly address and fix these issues rather than isolating. But I think the type of rhetoric that you see, I think some of the political posturing that you see is just going to have manifest impacts in adjacent areas that are unintended. But I do, in my head, see that as different than what we're talking about here. I don't think that the trade bills, for example, are rooted in an interpersonal bias or discrimination against Chinese people.
But all the tariffs that were put on China during the Trump administration, they're not really translating into anything good for us. For example, our farmers, it did not translate to anything positive for them. In fact, it put them into bankruptcy, if not anything else.
And I think the Trump trade war with China was a complete disaster. Obviously, much of that occurred prior to COVID, but an argument can be made that it made dealing with COVID far more complicated because he'd already disinvested in that relationship. We didn't have the functioning relationship when we could have used one. But again, I see that being different than, for example, what's happening right now in the Senate today with how we go about dealing specifically with, with Oppie hate crimes. As you and I discussed a little bit earlier, Senator Hirono and Congresswoman Meng introduced legislation specifically to address hate crimes against the Asian American community. And at the beginning of the week, the word was that it would get very little, if any, Republican support. And there's a question of whether it would even pass. It was scheduled for a vote yesterday. And then right before the vote, Senator Collins of Maine announced that she had worked out a compromise with Senator Hirono. And so I was very interested to see what this compromise was, because in her statements, Senator Collins said that the changes were intended to garner greater Republican support for the bill. And there's two issues here. One is the substantive critique of the bill, which Justin ahead of him just sort of nailed it point by point. He went through exactly what is wrong with the current structure of hate crimes legislation in the country, whether it be how you define it, how you measure it, underreporting, all of that. This bill doesn't address any of that. The bigger challenge is that in the modification, what they did is they actually took out all the references to Asian Americans. Other than in the preamble, they list by name each of the victims in Atlanta, but everywhere else in the bill, they specifically remove references to Oppie hate, references to Oppie community organizations, references to how this issue manifests itself in our community. And as an Asian American reading this, we started this conversation talking about what life was like back in the 1800s with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And reading this, the first thing that came to my mind is we've been whitewashed again just to get some Republican support. And it turns out that right before we got on this call, it actually did pass the Senate, but every single senator voted for it but one. And that one was Josh Hawley.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's a separate conversation in and of itself. But I'm still left, obviously, like anything we can do to aggregate data on hate crimes is good. Getting more resources into law enforcement is good. But I'm still so hurt and disappointed and disillusioned that it requires a stripping out of the reference to Asian Americans. As Justin said, if we don't advocate for ourselves, who's going to advocate for us? We had our elected Asian American political leaders doing the right thing, going to the floor, introducing legislation to defend our community, and the only way to get support was to whitewash it. And I think that's very disheartening. So when I look at the overwhelming support that it got, what I see is you had to get rid of the Asian factor to get that support. And that to me paints a very, very negative picture for what the future looks like. And the backdrop of the fact that we actually have an Asian American in the White House right now. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance on my part.
That's really that's disheartening right there. But oh gosh, I don't know what to say. But is there something? And this is an open question, and we can go one by one through the panel. We have around 10 minutes left for the program to end. And for our listeners on radio and on Facebook Live radio, we are on 1170 AM Radio Zindagi, and our handle on Facebook Live is Radio Zindagi. Please do watch us. Justin, Sarah, Sheridan, Sheikh, what are things that we can do locally, even if this is so dispiriting right here? What are things that we can do locally? And we can go around the panel to really list some of the things that you guys have been doing as local leaders and the visionaries, but things that us as Asian Americans should be thinking of and doing ourselves, help ourselves to not only educate our communities, but also be safe ourselves. Do you want to get started, Justin? And then we can go around the panel?
Sure, absolutely. I just want to mention one resource that people may not know about. Maybe they have. It's called stopaapihate.org. So that's stopaapihate.org. If you've ever experienced like a hate crime, you can report it there in a myriad of languages, including Punjabi and Hindi. And there are resources as well. For example, safety tips about what to do if you are experiencing a hate crime or if you're witnessing a hate crime. And, I think I saw Bangladeshi also there as well. And I think that, and why I lead with this is because many of the people tuning in or people who are more in tune with this issue, perhaps they know more and perhaps they are the ones who are less at risk of, no, everyone's at risk, I will say this, but, spreading and disseminating this information to people, for example, seniors, people whose native language is not English, and also just speaking up when you hear or experience these issues on social media and sharing that and sharing compassion, I think as well. I think that's always a very strong step towards doing something locally, I think.
That's really powerful, Justin. Thank you so much for. So Justin says, please go to stopaapihate.org. This is a website where you can report hate crimes, and that is one of the solutions that he has recommended. Sarah?
Yes. Well, I just want to start with saying right now, there are no laws or policies that can remove prejudice or biases or stop them from growing. I'm going to repeat that. There's no laws or policies that can stop or remove prejudice and bias from an individual. Why is that important to know? Because individuals change policies and systems. And if those individuals are not enlightened, then we're going to end up with what Sheka said about this piece of legislation that was whitewashed. The people who took all of that Asian out, what was their consciousness? Dr. King recognized we could pass all the laws we want. You cannot legislate the heart. Bias comes from the heart, not the mind. It starts in the mind, but goes into the heart. So my organization has wonderful programs that are free. Planting the seeds of equality in children. It's called Singing Equality Across America and around the world. Children do not come into the world with biases. They learn it. We all acknowledge that. Why not plant the seeds of equality early through a song? Everybody can go to worldunityinc.org. The music sheets are there. The children love the song. I'm advocating for the millions of children who don't even know the song exists, because those who have learned it love it. In fact, one child said the song was so powerful for her, she said, one day the world will hear this song and it will stop discrimination. That's how powerful she felt it was. Your station also has a 30-second PSA, and I hope you share it, because as Einstein said, you cannot solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. You must stand on a higher ground. I love quotes, as you can tell. I also want to end with a quote by Madame Curie, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in Science. She said, "You cannot hope to build a better world without improving the individuals. To that end, each of us must work for our own improvement." I suggest all the people in the legislature, senators, congresspeople, work on themselves so that we can get the right piece of legislation passed that protect all citizens of America.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that. I think that was very powerful. I think we have to start with ourselves. We have to start young. And as Sarah said, it is the communities, it is the families, it is the kids that have to be taught first. And thank you so much for all of that, Sarah. That was really indeed very powerful. Sheridan, where do you think we should start as communities, as individuals, to help ourselves?
Okay, so as a serial entrepreneur in Silicon Valley and a screenwriter, I'm doing 4 things, and it's easy to do. On social media, I have 100,000 followers in Facebook on the Silicon Valley Global Network, and probably like 15,000 on LinkedIn. And I always speak out about and criticizing certain policies, speaking freely, because it's very powerful. People watch and they're all echoing. So I want to set the agenda from an Asian American point of view because it's really important. The second thing I do is I talk with my friends, especially non-Asian Americans, red states in particular. I love talking to people in the other parts of the country. Listen to what they're saying to me because it's so important. You know, people in Texas and Michigan. So I really value their input. And when we talk as friends, it's easier to break down the stereotypes. So that's the other thing we do. I'm a screenwriter. I just finished a screenplay about anti-Asian hate in Chinatown. So that I've written about 18 screenplays, the latest. I'm setting up a studio with Black, Latino, Asian, and other screenwriters and filmmakers in Hollywood and here. And we're going to be going global. We're pulling together film slates of Black screenplays, Latino screenplays, mine, and others. And so one of the things that we're trying to do, because Hollywood is all white so far, except maybe one or two this year, and we need to change, we need to control the storytelling and narrative in Hollywood because they produce about 80% of the mass media, TVs and movies and documentaries. So if we don't control that, we will always be ignored and invisible minorities with no voice. And people could say and make us the butt of jokes forever unless we are at the table. So I think I agree with Justin. Justin, we need to have more young Asian Americans in politics so we are represented locally, nationally, and internationally. And then the media and education, all the key points of power, we need to be present and outspoken. And I think if we do that, they can't ignore us.
That's very powerful, Sheridan. Yes, storytelling is indeed a very important aspect of not only documenting our histories, our stories, but also getting through to the right people, but also getting through forever, because that is what gets documented. Sheikh, what do you think at a community level, as individuals? What is it that we can do despite the failure of the legislations? And again, another whitewash of legislative efforts. What is it that we could do individually to safeguard ourselves and our communities?
I will piggyback off Sarah and use a quotation to advance thought. And Mandela said that education is the most powerful weapon that we can use to change the world. But education doesn't just happen in a classroom. As Sheridan said, it's the relationships that we have between ourselves and between those that are different than us, the red states, but also our Black and Latino brethren, really everybody. You're starting to see a generation of Asian American political leadership, not just Kamala Harris, but you've got Representative Jayapal Khanna, Krishnamurthy, Chairman Mark Takana, who I work for, Senator Hirono, Congresswoman Chu, many others. But beyond the political leadership, we also need dialogue and leadership at the community level by engaging in these conversations, explaining, educating the casual racism that undergirds a lot of the othering of Asians. It's not just the hate crimes, right? It's people like many of us perhaps who were born and raised in this country, but people still in a professional context comment on how well we speak English or ask, no, where are you really from? When we say where we're from, like those little, whether you want to call them microaggressions or whatever, it is still a fundamental part of the othering that keeps Asian Americans separate from truly becoming part of America. And I think the education that we need to do as individuals on the community level is showing what Asian Americans have to contribute, what we bring to the table, what we've done, what we've achieved contributes greatly to that mosaic that is the strength of America. And to really overcome the issue of othering, we have to approach it from both ends, not just the hate crimes, which you deal with legally and through law enforcement, but also sort of what I would call the extension of soft power and building these relationships, standing up for ourselves, explaining who we are, and calling out those incidents that are used to other us.
That is so well said. That's amazing. You know what? One thing the pandemic might change is, like, if anybody asks me again where I'm from, I can actually say I'm from Moderna because of the vaccination I've just had. But having said that, thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Sheikh, Sheridan, Sarah, Justin, this was such a wonderful discussion to have. I hope to have you guys back again for another round of this discussion later in the year, of course. Of course, we will see how this goes and if this legislation does help or if there's something else that develops in this issue. Thank you once again for being on Radio Zindagi 1170 AM and on our Facebook Live at Radio Zindagi. Thanks once again. Have a good one. Till next time. Bye.
Bye.